go ahead and get started. And to start with, what I want to say is we need to sort of have a baseline, and that is to think about when you start thinking about publishing, you need to consider your own needs. And that is, why am I publishing? And in that case, it might be a good idea to make a list of the places that you have published already, that you have attempted to publish, where your colleagues are publishing, things like that, just so you have an idea of where you might want to start. Because as we're going to examine, knowing where you want to go is sort of the first step in actually publishing. It's also really important to think about relationships that you might have formed in the past. If you're sort of, I don't want to say an expert, but you're not new to publishing, you might actually know some people. And in that case, it's a good idea to sort of take advantage of those relationships and say, hey, I published in your journal before, or even use names of colleagues that have published and say, hey, I'm interested in publishing in your journal. What can I do? Because let's be honest, it's a business like anything else, and relationships matter. So think about those journals, think about where you really want to be, and then think about, okay, what is it that I want to get out of this experience? And then think about, are those expectations reasonable? As we all know, myself included, we all want to publish in the best journal out there. However, in some cases, that is really hard. And I can tell you from personal experience, I've wanted to get to the top tier journal, but sometimes you have to work your way up the steps. And to be quite honest with you, the publishing landscape is really changing, so that the way that we look at these journals, those measures that we might have used in the past are quite different nowadays. And we need to consider, maybe we need to start somewhere else, or maybe we need to reconsider how we're thinking about publishing in general. And maybe we just really want to get our information out there as quickly as possible. And in that case, goals might be something different. So think about needs, your experiences, and how they might affect your actions as someone who wants to publish. And then think about which journals are relevant to your area. Should you go ahead and attempt to publish in that top tier journal right away? And also, for your purposes, might there be another place that you might try publishing first in order to just kind of get your information out there and do your best? Because if your objective is just to publish, maybe something that doesn't have so many hoops to jump through is really the best way to go. So these are just all questions to kind of have in mind as you determine where you want to publish. Now, once you kind of have those ideas brewing in your mind, you're going to want to start with kind of a data-driven approach. And that is, you're going to want to think about those titles and then use some of the resources that we have available to review those journals and learn more about them. Now, we have some guides that will help you. We have them organized by discipline that will allow you to check for currency, changes in publication flow, title changes. Sometimes in the middle of a run, a publication will completely change names because it moves to another institution or because another publisher takes over. And in that case, you'd want to know that, so you understand that this is actually a continuation of Journal A, but it just has a slightly different name. You also would want to take a look at some journal directories like Ulrich's Web and Cabell's. And to be honest with you, we are in the process of trying to get a trial of Cabell's. We don't have that at the moment. However, we are working on getting that set up. And once it's available, you will be able to see the link to it on the library website. And just so you know, Cabell's covers mostly medical and health sciences related journals, with some social sciences and businesses journals as well. But if you're not looking at any of those areas, it's not going to be much help because it doesn't cover anything outside of those areas. So if your area is outside of medicine, health, anything related to health sciences, some social sciences, and they weren't very clear on which ones, to be honest, or business, it's not going to be a place to look for your journal title. It's not going to give you the information that you want to find. But those directories will give you information on statistics like acceptance percentages. It'll give you some metrics. It'll give you information on author or article publishing fees, which we'll get into in just a moment. And it will also tell you more about the publishing practices of those journals. And in the case of some of these, like Cabell's, which is actually really well organized for what it does cover, it will tell you if there are problems that have been reported with that particular journal, which can be really helpful as you determine whether that could possibly be a predatory journal. So it's a really good place to start. If there's information there, use it. If not, move on. All right, so we need to talk about, before we get started, ethics. So one of the best places that you can go to find out information on ethics is COPE, or the Committee on Publication Ethics. And they have a great website. I've linked to it in this presentation. I've also given you the exact link that will take you there. And this is an organization that is focused on not only educating, but supporting all aspects of the process of publishing. This includes supporting publishers, researchers, editors, universities, everyone involved who is in the process of creating information that needs to be published. They provide information on guidelines and resources for promoting ethical practices in publishing, and offer suggestions for best practices. They sometimes offer workshops or seminars on, how to complete these, how to create them. And also they will help you sort of by providing statements against unethical activities that maybe you can then take back to your individual institutions or organizations if you're interested in creating your own discussions or statements, or coming out with some kind of way to show that you are really think that this is something important to share with the rest of the people in your group. So it's something to think about, taking a look at their website. Also, keep in mind that most publishers, independent publishers, have their own guidelines as well, as a reaction to both researchers' concerns and also things that have happened in the publishing business and that are happening behind the scenes that we're just sort of learning about in terms of AI. And most of these statements and guidelines are going to be available on the publishers' websites. But because these are individual publishers we're talking about, you're not going to be able to go to one place and find every statement all at once. So just keep that in mind as you move forward. All right, so once we get into the actual ethics of publishing, we have several things to consider. Now, first of all, developing a systematic approach to ethics in publication ensures that the process of publishing information, as well as the information that is shared via that process, supports accepted methodologies and expectations. Now, these methodologies are definitely going to differ slightly from one discipline to another. However, the need to maintain the creation and distribution of high quality research is always going to be the same. Thus, members of the publication cycle, from the publisher to the editor to the reviewer to the researcher/author in this case, and I'm going to actually be using researcher and author sort of interchangeably here. And in this case, I'm going to use it to refer to the person or group of people who are responsible for creating the information and that is about to be published, need to be aware of and accepting of the established standards of ethics in their area. Problems can arise when any one particular party takes a shortcut or ignores those practices. And it's not just authors that do this. Sometimes it's the publishers, which is why we really need to sort of focus in on some of these issues. Ethical practices can also relate to specific steps in the research and publishing process. And foremost in most scholars' minds is always going to be the need to cite sources to give credit to the work that came before, providing the substrate on which new research can be built. And this is something that we all do when we go through the process of something like a lit review, or the very basic bottom level of just doing research to see what's out there, what people are saying about your topic, has it been done before, and so forth. However, as we all know, citing sources in the form of a works cited or a bibliography page also shows that you, as a researcher, understand your field, that you know what your colleagues have done and can relate the previous work that has been done to what you're currently working on, and that you can then use what you found in the past to sort of synthesize new information and explain how this carries out or creates new venues for research for others in the future and sort of adds to the scholarship of a field. What you might not consider, though, is that other things need to be considered as well, and that these things can affect the research process. For instance, acknowledging only significant contributions from authors, ensuring agreement among authors to be part of the process and to take responsibility for what is published is really important. And also taking care to be cognizant and honest about the conflicts of interest that may or may not be part of the process are really important in order to maintain ethical standards in publishing. In addition, many professional organizations and publishers have statements on the use of things like AI in research and also in generating content. And as these things develop and become more advanced, this becomes even more important and will also change the way that publishers look at whether we should be using or how we can use AI. And in my opinion, as a researcher and as a librarian, it's not something that we're going to get away from. It's something that we're going to have to find a way of including, and they are going to be written into the statements on ethical publishing that publishers create, because there's no way that we're going to stop using AI in these areas. So authors need to be aware of these expectations, not only before, but during and after the writing process, since the tools can affect the way information will be cited. And just in general, the best way to avoid any inadvertent issues with ethical standards is to be aware of expectations first and to review your practices on a consistent basis, especially as technologies change. And if new people are added to the team, if you decide at the last minute to bring someone else in because your research takes a turn and you think, well, actually, we should be talking to so-and-so because he or she might be an expert and we really need that perspective. So as you're going through the process, you need to make sure that you're continuously reassessing whether your actions and the actions of everyone on the team continue to be ethical. All right, so that's a lot to kind of digest. And what I wanted to do next is to talk a little bit about some of the issues, and this is just honestly like a handful, and it's more than a handful, but there's so much to talk about when it comes to ethical practices when you're publishing. So just to kind of go through just a few things here, I want to give you a few things to consider. First of all, when you avoid unethical practices in publishing, you need to think about at least these things. And some of them may not apply to what you're working on currently, but some of them may crop up in the future, or they may come up and you haven't even considered how they affect the work that you're doing right now. Because to be honest with you, I was like, I hadn't thought about this from my perspective, and they do affect things that I have done and am doing currently. So if you really are interested in delving, I wouldn't even say delving, I would say diving directly into the deep end here, there's a really great article that I'm going to share the DOI of at the end that's called Best Practice Guidelines on Publishing Ethics, A Publisher's Perspective. And it's published by the publisher Wiley. It was originally published in 2006 and updated in 2014. And that's the most recent update, which tells you it's not even that up to date. So they did sort of start to think about AI and how that fits into the mix. But it looks like, I would bet more than anything, that there's going to be another update coming out very soon. So for instance, on this list, we see things like duplication or redundant publication. And many of you probably understand this already, but just to kind of review, this involves publishing an article in multiple locations simultaneously. Now, depending on the publisher that you are using, so this is where you really need to sort of get into the weeds with the publisher that you are working with. And I'm specifically talking here about journals, because in this case, it's very likely that some journals will have what they call a preprint version available on their server, which means that even though it's assigned to a journal that may be coming out in, let's say, September 2024, it's available in April 2024. Some journals, some publishers may consider, and some organizations, some professional organizations may consider having that preprint article online prior to the publication date. They may consider then publishing it later they consider that a duplicate or redundant publication. Now, this may seem kind of strange because you're saying, well, it's the same publication, it's just coming out a little earlier, but that's something that's decided on by the journal, by the different organizations involved. So it's just something that you need to be aware of. Now, in general, abstracts, posters, findings, and results that you publish in a database or clinical trial registry where you don't discuss the findings and you just publish the results are generally exempt from this. But that's not a rule, it's only a statement. So this is where you really need to sort of dig in with your publisher and understand what your professional organization expects and does not count as a duplicate publication. Okay, another thing to consider is text recycling. Now, this one is pretty obvious. If you teach, you know what I'm talking about. You have students who reuse papers. There's always going to be times when you, as an author, say, well, I did research on something similar back in, 2022. And some of it might be very important to what I'm doing right now. And I see how I can make this connection. And maybe I want to reuse some of that information. And in that case, maybe you can really make the case that, it's a good idea for you to cite your own work and include it in your new publication. But in general, most publishers are not going to accept that. And they're going to have a hard time accepting that you've done that. And they're going to question you pretty hard about that. So you need to be able to explain how that particular work or the piece of work that you're using really makes the case and really needs to be part of what you're producing now, because otherwise it just looks like you're reusing work from the past. So just think about it, and also make sure that if there are rules that are set out by your publisher, that you're aware of those again. So this is one of those situations where know what your publisher expects and what they allow. Third, and this one gets kind of interesting, human rights, privacy, and confidentiality. Now, obviously, when you're using data collected on human subjects, there's a lot to think about. Things like IRB approval, adherence to relevant agency guidelines and expectations, statements outlining processes that support adherence to requirements, things like that. You need to basically make sure that any of those things are available at all times if anyone ever asks you for them. Because if you can't produce the documentation that says that the study that you're working on, the research that you're doing has gone through the appropriate channels in order to be approved by your university, by your professional organization, by whichever other organizations might be involved in your research, if it has to do with human subjects, then you're basically in trouble. So you need to make sure you have all of that ready. And in the end, if you don't have it ready to go, and especially when the publisher asks you for it, basically you can't use your research. So it's basically like you did something for nothing. In addition to following guidelines for human subjects, you also need to be aware of how the work that you're doing might affect culturally sensitive issues. And this is what I think is really important here. Consider the triggering effects of data and how you share it. Now, I don't know about you, but I probably didn't think about this before as a researcher, but it's really something we need to think about now, given how many graphic images are out there, how people respond to information, and just sort of the general tenor of the world today, and how easy it is for people to become upset by information. So it can take it to the extreme, of course. Now, this really kind of gets us off topic, but it's important to consider how you share your information. Are you using images, graphs, tables, written descriptions, and so forth? And you need to think about how people of other cultures might respond to what you're sharing. Now, obviously, it will never be possible to avoid triggering someone, especially if your work maybe veers towards something that could be a little bit controversial. But as researchers, we can be sensitive, at least, to how intended audiences might be affected, and take care to learn how to avoid being intentionally or unintentionally thoughtless to our global colleagues. And I'm going to give you a good example of that in just a minute. All right, next thing up, registering clinical trials. As I mentioned before, not just with human subjects, but with any subjects, you are going to have to follow any rules associated with the use of your research. And that is basically, if you don't have that information, it is grounds for sort of exclusion from publication. And your publisher is not going to care. They're not going to think, oh, it's just an oversight, because basically they're just going to see it as, oh, you don't have it. It's unethical for us to publish without it. We can't do it. So, I mean, you may have some leeway in terms of, oh, I'll get it for you and send it as soon as possible. But when you're dealing with publishers they are businesses, I mean, do not forget, the bottom line for publishers is that they are out to make money. They are not out to support research for the most part. I mean, you may have good relationships with publishers. I mean, I can tell you, we visit regularly with people from EBSCO. We visit regularly with people from a lot of the publishers that you're probably working with right now. And as nice as their reps might be, and they bring us nice little pens and little folders and things that, oh, it's very nice of them to bring us, and they might take us out for lunch once in a while, but I can tell you it's a business. And if they're not making money, they are not going to be happy. So we really need to make sure that if you want to publish, that you are following those guidelines. So make sure that you have all of those numbers in line, any registration numbers that have to be included, any statements that tell you, that explain how your work adheres to industry norms, so that you can just provide it at that moment and say, here it is, this is what you wanted, here it is right now, ready to go. PDF version, here it is, emailed to you, uploaded wherever it needs to go. Next up, using animals in research. As you know, most universities have offices that deal specifically with this. But as with humans, there are rules associated with the use of animals. So make sure that you ask for assistance from your publisher and or the governing body that you work with when there's any confusion. Additionally, consider that the development of AI has made it possible to run simulations. So just with humans, consider whether the study that you're running actually needs those animals, or whether it can be carried out without or with fewer animals, and provide explanations for your choices. I mean, people are moving more and more towards the simulation mode. Obviously, in some cases, you definitely want people to have the experience when it's necessary of working with real live subjects. And in some cases, it's not possible to do that. But in certain cases, maybe you can just do a simulation. Maybe it's good enough for that particular paper, and maybe you can explain why. And there's a lot of maybes here, but it's just another question. It's more fodder for you to consider as you move forward with the ethics of publishing. And it just becomes more and more difficult as you sort of think about all of these things at once. So I would just advise to take these step by step, work with your team, work with your publisher, go back to the research that you're doing, and sort of ask yourself these questions sequentially, and really think deeply about what you're doing before you just dive right in. Next up, thinking about biosecurity. Researchers are asked now to consider where there's the possibility for malevolent or benevolent use of their findings. And basically that means that they call this option a dual use research. And many journals now require that research conforms to National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, or NSABB guidelines. Basically, we want to avoid malevolent use, which is when people use your research for unintended purposes that turn out to be bad. I mean, that's sort of my very basic definition. And in many cases, it's difficult to gauge. I mean, how do you know what researchers 20 years from now are going to do with your research? But it's up to you, and it's imperative that you, as an ethical researcher, think about, is there any possibility that someone could take what I'm doing and turn it into something bad? And if so, what can I do to either try to prevent that, or make it clear that this is not what it was intended for? So it's just another thing, part of this whole discussion, this whole, where am I going with my research? What am I thinking about? What do I need to do? All right, next, criteria on authorship. Well, it's really easy, and I can tell you this happens a lot, I think, in certain fields more than others, to say, well, this person's doing the data set, this person's doing the write-up, and you suddenly, you suddenly might have, something like maybe 8, 9, 10 people listed as authors. But it's really important for ethics in publishing to think about who are the ones who have made the significant contributions to the work. Authors should be the ones who make those contributions. This includes from start to finish. So designing the work, drafting and researching the work, providing final approval of the version that is going to be published, and then agreeing to be held responsible for all aspects of the work, including any challenges to the integrity. It's really easy when you're maybe the last person on, listed to say, hey, I just checked the citations. And someone comes in and says, well, I'm not sure I agree with your findings. And all I did was check the citations. All I did. But if you're going to be listed as an author, you should be ready and you should be able to defend your work and say, well, actually, this is why your challenge is not right. Or you should be able to say, you know what? I never really thought about it from that perspective. I can see why you would ask that question. So as authors, if you're listed, you should be the last person is just as responsible as the first person when it comes to ethics. So I also suggest here that, you need to have discussions as you create your work so that when you create your bibliography, it's not only correct, but it's culturally sensitive. And what that means is, as I mentioned before, we're going back to this whole considering the human aspect of publishing. And that is when we talk about what is culturally sensitive ethics in publishing, that means that there are certain types of activities that other cultures outside of the US may not consider appropriate. And as publishers may not think about this as much because they want to get your product out there. But as ethical publishers ourselves, as the ones creating the work to be published, we need to be aware of our audience and how the work that we're creating might affect those people. The example that I'm going to give here is, for instance, the use of Aboriginal Australian resources. There's a lot of things that are not allowed, that are not acceptable within this community that we might do here in the US that could be extremely offensive to people in that group. So as ethical publishers, we really need to consider, how are we citing our sources? What are we doing? For instance, in that culture, it is not acceptable to use the name of people who are dead. So that is something that if your work somehow relates to that culture, that you would want to be aware of, number one, because knowing that people in that culture are likely going to be doing much of that research and probably going to be consumers of your research, you would want to be aware of that and think about, how am I going to handle this situation? So that's kind of all on you as the researcher, because it's your responsibility to make sure the research you produce is ethical. It's the responsibility of the journal to make sure their part is also ethical, but it's coming back to you. You're the one who created it, so you also need to be part of this process, as we spoke about earlier. So that's a lot to digest, like I said, and it just gets messier and messier as you kind of dive into it. But these are just a few things that I thought were really kind of interesting and important, and to kind of get you started on thinking about, what do I really need to be aware of to begin? It is really specific to discipline. Some of this stuff will not apply to you if you're not in the sciences or not in the health sciences, or if you're in the humanities, you might have a different perspective. But this is all sort of just very general, and some of it you probably are already aware of and you already do. But the reason I bring it up is because I want you all to know that this is something that everybody is told, everybody should know. And whether you're just doing research for your area or whether you're collaborating, you need to know how to do this stuff, and at least where to go to find this information. And the best place to go to find this is to go directly to your publisher's website, to talk to the person that you are working with at your journal, or to look for it on one of these websites that talks more about ethical publishing. So moving on, we're going to talk about how to find those journals. Once you know what you want to do, once you know you have this idea and you thought about, okay, I think a good place for us to publish our research given our topic, let's take a look at some of the options out there and think about which one we want to settle on as a group. So what I think is a good place to start is to look at some of our journal finders. Now, these can help you find journal titles using an article title or an abstract. It can also help you find additional articles on relevant topics. It can help you find authors publishing in similar fields. information on authors' rights before and after the publication or acceptance process. And this is all good information for you to know because you always want to know what your rights are as the author. And not only your rights, but your responsibilities. And all of this stuff is going to be covered in this information. Now, some of you may be familiar with these that I've listed: Jane SPI or Spy Hub, MDPI Journal Finder, and Sherpa Romeo. But these are all created by different groups, and you can link directly to them and you can look them up. Some of them are a little bit more basic than others. I think that Jane is really nice. I think SPI Hub is pretty good. Sherpa Romeo is very cool. They give you really good information about different journal titles that might be useful to you as a researcher, and it will give you a really good place to start if you have something in mind. And again, it's very useful to find out what your rights are and what they're expecting from you before you actually decide to go ahead and submit. So take a look at that. And it will also tell you more about the cost because that's important as well. Some other things to think about, and these are things that people sometimes don't really consider before they start publishing, and that is some journals don't accept cold submissions. It depends on the discipline. Some places they have all the publication information. If you want to submit, right in the front, the submission info is listed for you right in the front of the journal or right on their website or wherever it might be, and they want whatever you have. Some of them might have really long publication cycles and wait lists because they have special themed journals that are coming out and the issue isn't really going to be open. They're not looking for people until 6 months from now, 8 months from now. So depending on what your goals are as a researcher, you might want to look somewhere else. You want to look at the formatting. It's important. It could affect publication, acceptance, and they might have you go back and redo the whole thing. And I will just warn you right off the top, sometimes they will tell you we use an insert name of style, whatever one is specific to your discipline. But then when you look very closely at the rules that they provide and the examples that they offer, it's not exactly the same. It's kind of, yes, but we do a little bit of, it's a little bit different. In my field, for instance, they always say that we use either APA or Chicago. And I'll tell you, I'm not a huge fan of Chicago, and I'm definitely not an expert. But when I look at Chicago in the manual versus the Chicago style they give you as an example, it's not the same. And if I do it versus the manual style and then I submit it, they send it back to me and they tell me, no, do it our way. And their way is definitely not the same. So you just need to look at that stuff. Be open to publishing in cognate fields. You know, you may say, well, I'm a scientist and I want to publish in a journal that deals specifically with chemistry. But maybe there's some overlap with another area that you haven't thought about that will open up a few more journal titles that are really good that you had not thought about before. So be open to it. And again, this also goes back to at what phase are you in your journey? If you're just starting out, maybe this is something you want to do. If you've published many times before, then maybe you say, no, I know exactly where I want to publish. I know the rules. I don't care. I don't want to do that. So in that case, it would not really apply to you. So it's really up to you to make that decision, but it's a suggestion in case you need more options. Also, look at the current table of contents to look for themes and common topics. Is there something that they like to publish about over and over and over again? Do they always want this kind of data? And if you say to yourself, well, they are really into the hard quantitative data and my work really is more qualitative, that's probably a mismatch. So you want to know that right up front, because that probably is going to mean that eventually you're going to have trouble and they might not accept your article, even if it's great. So just know what they're looking for ahead of time, because you're not going to be able to change their minds. They know what they're looking for and they're going to take what they want. And even if you have the best article ever, unless you're a well-known person whose name is impossible to just ignore, they're probably not going to take it if it doesn't fit in with what they expect. So next up, some basics about impact factors. And this comes up a lot because I think people sort of often misunderstand what they are. So we have bibliometrics, which in general is just a statistical method to analyze publications. Citation analysis, examination of frequency of and patterns within citations. This stuff is important. I mean, you want to think about this, at least have it in the back of your mind. This is is used to identify the most important. I use that in quotation marks because I really, really want to stress this. Most important. That would depend on who you're asking. The most important publications may not be the same ones if you ask 2 or 3 different people. But in general, you may say, well, this is the top one in my field, and maybe most people will agree. But again, remember, this is also based on reputation. So, problem with citation analysis does not account for different citation and publication practices among or within disciplines. So if your area falls kind of on a margin, then it could be more difficult to figure this out. And one point that's very important here is it should only be used as one of many factors when you choose a publication. And again, this goes back to the point that I made first, and I want you to remember this, if nothing else, it depends on what your goals are as a researcher and where you are in your process as a publishing author. You need to know where you stand and what you need to do and what your goals are. And then you can make the decision of how important the actual impact factors are. Now, to delve a little deeper into impact factors, the impact factor, which is usually called the IF or the Journal Impact Factor, JIF, measures the importance, and again, I say importance in quotation marks, based on the number of times the articles have been cited, the articles within that journal. It is based on the number of citable articles, and that is established by that journal, published for 2 years, the past 2 years, and the number of articles, the citations for the year following those 2 years. So for instance, if you look at this that I've given you, the impact factor for 2019 would equal the number of citations available in 2019, the number of citable publications for 2018, plus the number of citable publications for 2017. And that would give you the impact factor. And this uses citations as indexed in Clarivate's Web of Science. So it's only pulling from one place to get this number. So what I'm going to say here is that this tool was originally developed to help librarians decide which journals to buy and somehow became a measure of academic success. Scholars often misuse this and base their publishing decisions only on the number, and they also judge their peers' publications only on the number, and that's kind of unfair in many cases. The impact factor has become the subject of much criticism because of the limited statistical validity and because it does not address publishing practices in all disciplines equally. And if you're interested in something like this, I can tell you there are a lot of journal articles published about the problems with impact factors. Some journals, for instance, publish higher numbers of review articles, which can affect the impact factor and falsely inflate the number. And the proliferation of systematic reviews in recent history is an example of that. So journals might also limit citable articles to intentionally affect the impact factor. And because there's not a standard for what citable means, the variations mean that the impact factor should not be used as the only metric that you use to evaluate that journal. So I've probably said that a million times, don't only use impact factor. And I tell that to everyone I meet, and that's because it's easy to inflate. It's easy to affect the number falsely. It doesn't always tell the whole story. And I think if you base your decisions only on the impact factor, you're leaving out a whole bunch of really good journals that you could very well be publishing in, and you could be getting those, those lines in your CV. And if you're just going on impact factor, I think you're missing out, is what I'm going to say. Just don't miss out because you don't think it's a great journal based on the impact factor. All right. Oops. All right. Other journal and author level metrics. There's a bunch more, as you can see. And I've tried to give you a kind of table that I think is kind of helpful, and what they actually measure and a description of what they measure and where you can find out more information, where they're pulling from. For instance, the eigenfactor, the H index or the Hirsch index, the G index, the Psi, Imago, journal and country rank, Google Scholar, and so forth. So if you're interested in finding out more about some of these metrics, and as you can see, there's a lot of them. It's not just the IF, they have a ton of other ones. And some of them apply to journals specifically, and some apply specifically to authors within those journals. So for instance, a journal would have an impact factor, an author would have an H index. So if you're interested in finding out maybe what yours is, you can find out by going to, you can go to my little code down there with the dinosaur in the middle. You can also, look it up on Web of Science or Scopus or Google Scholar, or you can go to any of the websites that are listed there to find out more about what each of those metrics actually means in terms of your own performance. But again, they are subject to problems, and they don't necessarily mean that your work is better and or worse or anything else than someone else's. It just means maybe it gets cited a lot because that journal, because you've published a lot, that's great. And I'm not saying anything about the quality of publications, but there is the possibility that someone publishes a whole lot and has a really, high number, and someone publishes more selectively and has a lower number and in better journals. So it's just something to think about. Again, this is all just food for thought, and there's a lot of food for thought here. There's a lot to consider. So I'm just putting it all out there for you. But please consider all of these things and don't just rely on one. All right, so should I care about rankings or impact factors? I'm going to say yes, but don't rely on one. Be open to alternative options. Consider alt metrics in addition to your traditional metrics. And if you want to find out more about what alt metrics means, FSU has a great LibGuide. We borrow from each other very often because we share, and we're all in Florida and we help each other out. So if you want to learn more about alt metrics, go right ahead. They are very interesting. Has to do with the number of times you may be mentioned on Twitter, something like that. All of the social media, things like that. So it's just kind of cool to know who's mentioning you and who's retweeting, who's talking about the work you're doing. And it's just another way of sort of gauging the effect that your work has on the community as a whole. And it's a little bit more widespread than something like an impact factor that is very specific to just the academic community. So it's kind of cool to know that people are talking about you. Going back to journal rankings, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Again, know your own goals, talk to your colleagues, talk to your department chair, talk to your mentor. Think about what is most important for you at your stage in your career. Do you really need that high-level journal, or do you really just want to get your name out there and see what you can do? So I can't answer that question for you. I can tell you what I think if you ask me, having been in the field for quite some time. But again, that's your decision in the end. All right, now we move on to kind of a fun topic, and that is predatory publishing and what it actually is, because I think people have sort of a misunderstanding of what it does and what it is, what it isn't. It's a fee-based service that does not provide the expected services in return. So you send in your article, they tell you, we'll publish it for you for $1,500, and then they don't do anything. That's predatory publishing. This does not necessarily include journals that do publish your article for a fee, because there are lots of journals out there that do require fees for publishing. So the practice of asking for money does not necessarily mean that it's a bad journal. It just means that they ask for money. And that's unfortunate because, as we all know, especially at state universities in Florida, our budgets are limited. And I can tell you right now that the library does not offer funding for publishing. We do have some discounts available that I will talk about in just a minute, but we do not defray the cost of publishing. So that's something to keep in mind. Predatory publishers often charge withdrawal fees or additional fees later on if you decide you don't want to publish. So if you say, well, hey, you know what? I decided I don't want to publish here after all, because after I did my research, it turns out this is not a very good journal and I don't like it. They're probably going to charge you to not publish it, which is not a cool thing to do. And that is definitely a sign that it's a predatory publishing situation. This also includes publishers that are actively deceptive, not just inept. As we all know, there are people out there that we might really like who just don't know what they're doing. They're not bad people, they just don't know what they're doing. Well, predatory publishers are the ones who are bad. I mean, they know what they're doing and they do it anyway. They're not just making a mistake and be like, oops, we forgot to do this. No, they did it on purpose and they might lie about it. So they're just bad publishers. And if you have more questions about predatory publishing, definitely take a look at that link to that LibGuide that I have provided for you as well, and see what they have to say about it. There's a whole lot to be said about predatory publishing, but this is sort of the basics. This is what you really need to know about predatory publishing and how to avoid it. And one thing I would also say here is that predatory journals are often very vague in scope and have editorial boards that are comprised of experts that are not qualified to review research in that supposed discipline area. And I can tell you for a fact that I have been contacted many a time to be an expert, so-called expert reviewer for journals in something like information technology, and that is not my field. And I'm pretty sure those are not good journals. I'm pretty sure they're predatory publishers, and I just ignore their emails because I don't want to be part of anything like that. But that's kind of a sense, and I would never recommend that journal to anyone. And if they came to me and said, I'm thinking of publishing in this journal, I would say, don't send them anything, don't write to them, don't get involved with that journal. So definitely not. Now, since we talked about what it is, let's talk about what it's not. Like I said, journals that use a pay-to-publish model. It's totally legitimate to use this. Many places have to. Open access journals are not considered, well, most open access journals are not considered predatory publishers. In fact, open access journals, or OAJs, are academic journals that publish scholarly work without charging fees, usually subscription fees. They rely on some author fees to enable access to free content, and many are highly regarded publications in a variety of fields. And as you can see, I have provided some links as well from the DOAJ, from Think Check Submit, and from publishingstate.com to tell you more about what actually is open access. If you're considering publishing in open access, I really do think that this is one of the fields that is going to grow quite a bit over the next maybe decade, because as we have fewer funds for the library, for the university as a whole, we're going to have to change the way that we subscribe to journals. And one way that we can do this is to go to open access. Open access means that it's available online all the time to anyone. You don't have to log in with any credentials. I can go there and read your article. Your mother can go there and read the article and doesn't need to have any special login. And it's kind of cool because it's a nice way to share information with the whole world. So it's kind of it's kind of a friendly way to think about academics. I'm sharing my information with you. So just consider, maybe if you hadn't thought about it before, maybe you want to do open access. It's a good way to get your information out there and share it with other people who might not be able to afford the fancy databases that we right now we have access to through the university. So just think about that. Next up, paying for publication. Well, yes, we do sometimes have to pay for publication. The types of fees that are common in both traditional and open access journals are things like pre-acceptance fees. These are fees that help the journal reduce competition due to cost, increase speed of publication, and often increase the level of journal accountability because they're having to be responsible to the people who are paying to have their articles published. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. You also might be asked to pay for some subscription fees or membership fees for yourself. Now, this means you'll have access to everything. It doesn't mean that the people who are viewing your article will have to pay. In some cases, it might, depending on whether it's a traditional or open access journal. And there are ways to find out more about that, for instance, by looking at things like Cabell's or Ulrich's web, or looking at some of the journal finders that I linked to earlier, because they do have a lot of information on what type of journal they are and whether they require those kinds of fees. In other cases, there might be things like post-acceptance fees. And post-acceptance fees are things like APCs, or author article publishing charges. This might require you to pay for things like archiving the materials. If you have any color charts or things like images that need to be included in your publication. So you need to read through very carefully what they're expecting and what those fees cover. Because if you might say, well, I paid $1,500, can't you just publish my article? And they say, well, you have like 20 tables and one of them's in color, so we need another $800 from you. So you would be responsible for reading through the fine print and determining what fees are actually covering with that particular journal. So it's just something that you need to do as a very responsible publishing author. You need to be aware of these things. Okay, so ways you can decrease expenses. Well, first of all, think about your journal choice first, as we've been talking about this whole time. Also, look through what they're expecting from their authors so you know upfront and you can avoid surprises. If they tell you right off the bat, we require you to even consider publishing your article, we require you to submit $1,500 in the case that it is accepted. Before they even consider publishing that article, they're gonna need your $1,500. So think about that as you move forward. Be familiar with those costs, have it ready to go, and maybe have a few backup journals in case it doesn't work out, in case you say, well, you know what, this is really expensive. I do not have the budget to pay for this, and I don't want to have to go back and find more money later in case I have a longer article than I thought, or in case my tables aren't covered, or whatever it might be. So just think about that first. If the journal requires author payment, consider adding that cost into your grant, which is why it's so important that you do this early on. Ask about department funds. Some do, some don't. It's a place to go. It's a place, maybe not the place, but you could do that. Review our publishing LibGuide for information on discounts, because we do have some agreements with some major publishers. They're not big discounts. They're not going to decrease the cost by a lot, but anything helps. And also, if it's something that they seem to be very interested in, or that's a very hot topic in your field, or very new, or you think they really might be interested in, don't be afraid to contact the publisher directly to ask for assistance. Or review their website. I can also tell you that we have some people in the department that we work with our vendors who sell us these journals. And if you really need help, you could always reach out to us, and we could probably get someone to contact that journal on your behalf and say, listen, your fees are exorbitant, and we would really like for this researcher to be able to submit. Is there any chance that, given the fact that we just renewed with you, maybe you'd be willing to decrease this fee? Sometimes they're really nice about it, sometimes they're not, but it's at least worth asking, because if you don't ask, you don't know. So there's some ways you can possibly decrease the expenses. It's not going to make it zero, but 10, 15, 20% is better than 100%. So just think about that. All right, some red flags to just also think about. If the journal that you want to publish in sounds like another famous, well-known journal, probably not a good journal. They're just kind of trying to capitalize on the name. If the journal scope is wide and nebulous and you have no idea what they're talking about, if they're covering the humanities and medicine and not in a way that makes sense, if they have an article on ways to treat Alzheimer's right next to a review of some novel, it's probably sounds weird to me. I mean, I would think it's a strange journal. I would be hesitant. If the information provided includes unofficial or made up impact factors that you have never heard of, and now you have a table to look at. If you're like, I don't think this is a real impact factor and I can't find it anywhere in any literature or anywhere on the web, then it's probably not real. If the publisher contact is not available anywhere on the website, or they don't even have a website, then I would definitely say that's not a real journal. If they advertise a fast submission to publication time, and by fast, I would mean something like under a month, it's probably not a good place to publish, because as you may know, or as you might not know, but we'll probably find out, even these days, publishing, even with preprint servers, the process of publishing a journal article can be quite lengthy. It can take anywhere from, depending on how fast they want it published, anywhere from something like, I don't know, maybe I would say 3 to 7 months, depending on their cycles and what they need and how often they publish. So a month is really fast. If the articles in the journal have a ton of grammatical or spelling mistakes, if all the authors are from one country and they're all like maybe even from the same university, that's kind of a red flag too. If the information on charges is almost impossible to find, and if there's no information provided on policies like the peer review process or licensing or copyright, again, these are all things that should be freely available at any point to people considering publishing in a journal. So if this stuff isn't there for you to find, it's probably not a very good journal. This should be, this hands down should be freely available. There's no reason that you should not know this stuff. And hold on, something got missed here. Indicators of legitimacy. So if you find that the articles are indexed properly, their journal is registered in a directory, the journal explains its peer review process, the editors are experts in the field, you should be able to see the editors, they might even have an editorial board, they might have a list of some of their past peer reviewers, you should be able to see that they have qualifications that would make them capable of reviewing your work. If that's not there, that's a problem, but usually if they are legitimate, they will have all of that available. The journal's scope and purpose are clear, defined, and reinforced by the articles in that particular journal in several different issues of it, and on maintaining that over a period of time. It provides information on all of its processes from start to finish. The articles have DOIs. Now, I will say that is a relatively new thing in the past, I would say 5 to 10 years. So if you're looking at, they should have switched over by now. There are still some journals that instead of providing DOIs, they just provide like permalinks to their articles. So I would not say that if it does not have a DOI, it is not legitimate. I would just say, it should have some kind of permalink or DOI so you can go back to it at a later date. And for open access journals, the journal indicates the rights that the author retains or that users have, something like CC or Creative Commons licenses. And if you don't know what Creative Commons are, what the licenses mean, this chart over here shows you all of the different licenses, which is kind of small, and even if you could see it very well, you probably wouldn't understand it because I don't, but there is a link to an explanation of their licenses. It just means that sometimes you can say like there's open attribution, so basically people can reuse the information as long as they give you attribution, or it's possible they can reuse the information if they work in academics, or they can reuse it in settings where it's not for profit. So it just depends on how the information is being used and by whom. And they should indicate what their process is, what the CC licenses are available to authors publishing in the journal. And if that's not available, it should be made available to you as an author, because that is your right to have an idea of how people are using your information that you have created. So with that being said, next up,